My parents said, "You have 2 days to get out of this house." I said nothing and walked away. When they opened the safe, they froze. My mom called me nonstop for 30 minutes. "Don't do this, the lawyer, the documents, please." Before I tell you what was in that safe, you need to understand who I was before any of this happened. Because the version of me that stood in that hallway watching my father's face change, she didn't arrive there by accident. She got built slowly, over years of learning that the people who were supposed to show up for you sometimes just don't, and that you can either keep waiting or you can start showing up for yourself. My name is Mara. I'm 31 now. 3 years ago, I was 28, living in a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from downtown, working as an office manager at a physical therapy clinic. The job was steady. The apartment was mine. I had a routine I liked. Morning coffee on my small balcony, evening walks along the canal, a standing Friday dinner with 2 friends I'd had since college. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. And after a few years of piecing things together after a rough stretch in my mid-20s, solid felt like something worth protecting. I'd been building that life deliberately, the way you do when you know it can come apart if you stop paying attention. I wasn't in a relationship. I wasn't particularly looking for one. I was, for the first time in a while, okay with exactly where I was. Then my grandmother started forgetting things. It started small, the way it always does with dementia. She'd call me twice in the same day about the same thing, not realizing she'd already called. She'd tell me a story she'd told me the week before, word for word, the exact same pauses in the exact same places. And when I'd gently let her know she'd shared that one already, she'd laugh it off and say her memory was getting lazy. We both pretended that was all it was. But I'd started doing my own research by then, reading late at night on my phone, cross-referencing symptoms, learning the difference between normal age-related forgetfulness and something that ran on a different track entirely. The forgetting she was doing had a particular quality to it, not the misplaced keys kind, but the kind where you lose the thread of a recent conversation entirely while a memory from 40 years ago stays completely intact. She could describe in exact detail the dress she wore to her cousin's wedding in 1968. She could not reliably remember whether she'd taken her blood pressure medication that morning. My parents knew. I'd mentioned it to my mother twice before she cut me off. "Well, she's getting older, we all slow down," in the bright tone she used when she decided a conversation was finished. My father didn't engage with it, which was his standard approach to anything that might require him to change his schedule. My brother Ryan was 4 years older and lived 20 minutes from Grandma's house. By every external measure, the successful one. He was not driving over. He was not calling the pharmacy. He was not sitting with her on Sunday afternoons when she got confused about whether my grandfather was still alive. My grandfather had been dead for 11 years. Some evenings she knew that clearly. Other evenings she'd set 2 coffee cups out of habit and look at the second one for a long time before putting it back. In January, I called my mother directly and said Grandma needed someone in the house. There was a silence on the line that told me exactly who she thought that someone should be. I sat with that for 2 weeks. I made a list, the way you do when you're pretending a decision is practical when it's actually emotional. The list wasn't even close. What I'd be giving up was longer and more concrete. But when I drove over on a Saturday in February and found Grandma at the kitchen table at 11 in the morning still in her nightgown, stove left on, a pot of water boiled nearly dry, I stopped making lists. I gave my landlord 30 days notice. I told my clinic I needed to cut my hours back to part-time remote. I packed what I needed, put the rest in a storage unit, and moved into the guest bedroom at my grandmother's house on the 1st of March. I told myself it was temporary. Most decisions that change your life completely start out feeling temporary. I'd been living in my grandma's house for 3 years, not because I had nowhere else to go. I had an apartment, a job, a whole life I'd put on pause. I moved in because she had dementia, and no one else would. The first thing I learned about living with someone who has dementia is that it is not a single experience. It's 1,000 different experiences stacked on top of each other, and they don't follow a straight line down. There are days that feel almost normal, days where Grandma would be sharp and funny and present, where we'd sit on the back porch after dinner and she'd tell stories about her life that I'd heard before but wanted to hear again. She was a good storyteller, always had been. She had this way of building to a moment slowly, holding all the details until exactly the right second. On those days, it was easy to think I'd overreacted, easy to think she was fine, we were all fine, and I'd upended my life unnecessarily. Then there would be a bad stretch. A bad stretch looked like this. She'd wake at 2 in the morning convinced there was someone in the yard, not frightened exactly, more certain. She'd want to go see who it was, and I'd have to gently redirect her back to bed without making her feel foolish for being wrong, because making her feel foolish made the next hour much harder. I learned to say something like, "Let me check for you," and come back a few minutes later and report that everything was clear, all quiet, nothing to worry about. She'd nod and accept this and settle back down, and I'd go back to my own room and lie in the dark knowing I wasn't going to sleep for another 2 hours. In the mornings, I made breakfast and sorted her medications, 7 pills daily, each in a specific slot in the weekly organizer I refilled every Sunday. I drove her to appointments and kept a small notebook in my bag, writing down every question before we went and every answer while we were there. Numbers, dosage changes, anything about her trajectory. 1 notebook or year, dated, in a shoebox on the closet shelf. I handled the house. Old, built in the early 60s, well-maintained in the years when my grandfather was alive, but showing its age in the small ways old houses do when their owners can no longer keep up. The furnace needed servicing every fall. One of the upstairs windows had a broken latch. The gutters filled with leaves every autumn and had to be cleared before the rain. I learned that year more about home maintenance than I'd ever expected to know. I watched YouTube videos. I called the right people when I couldn't do it myself. My family's visits across across those 3 years I can count without running out of fingers. My parents came for Easter the first year and Christmas each year after that. 5 visits total. My mother would take over the kitchen on those days in a way that felt like help, but was actually displacement. Reorganizing things Grandma had kept in the same places for 40 years. My father would sit with Grandma for an hour and be genuinely patient, which I tried to remember when I was most frustrated with him. Ryan came once, in 3 years, once. He came on a Saturday in the second year, stayed 3 hours, took Grandma for ice cream, and left. When he said you're doing a great job on his way out, I recognized the tone, the one people use when they want credit for noticing something they've done nothing to contribute to. I'm not telling you any of this to make myself sound like a martyr. I'm telling you because the people who showed up twice and the people who showed up 0 times are the same people who sat across from me 6 months later and told me that the house belonged to all of us equally. What I remember most from those 3 years isn't the hard nights or the appointments or the maintenance calls. What I remember most is the ordinary afternoons, the way Grandma liked her tea with exactly 1 sugar and a little milk, not much. The way she'd hum to herself when she was comfortable. Old songs I half recognized from somewhere I couldn't place. The way she'd sometimes reach over while we were watching television and pat my hand, not saying anything, just the pat, like she was checking I was still there. She was still herself, even as pieces of her slipped away. That was the part nobody who wasn't there every day got to see. She was still funny. She was still sharp about certain things. She still had opinions about how to make a proper pie crust and would tell me if I was doing it wrong. She called me by the wrong name sometimes, called me her sister's name or her own mother's name, but when she was clear, she always knew exactly who I was. I think about that now when people ask what it was like. I tell them it was hard, and it was, but it was also, and I don't know if this makes sense, it was also the most consistently loving place I'd lived in as an adult. The house held something that hadn't existed much in my family growing up, which was simple daily presence. Just being in the same room as someone and not needing it to be anything more than that. I wasn't expecting to find that. I wasn't expecting to stay as long as I did. And I was definitely not expecting, on a Thursday afternoon in her last good autumn, for my grandmother to ask me to drive her downtown to see a lawyer. My parents lived 40 minutes away, showed up maybe twice a year. My dad paced the rooms with his hands in his pockets. My mom hugged Grandma, took pictures, and left before dinner. My brother lived even closer and came exactly 0 times in 3 years. He sent a birthday card with a gift card she didn't know how to use. I didn't do it for the house. I did it because she was the only person in my family who ever made me feel like showing up mattered. The turning point came in her 3rd winter with me, the February before she died. There was a specific night. I've replayed it so many times that I can still feel the temperature of the hallway, the way the overhead light in the kitchen was too bright at 2 in the morning, the particular kind of exhausted I was when I came downstairs and found her standing at the back door in her nightgown with her coat on over it, holding her purse. She said she needed to catch the bus. She said she was going to be late for work. My grandmother had not worked since 1987. I stood there for a second and took a breath, and then I said, "The bus doesn't come this late." And she said that was wrong, that the bus came at 1/4 every half hour, and she said it with complete authority, the way she used to talk about everything, and I had to not let my face do anything that would frighten her or make her feel wrong. I said, "Let me make us some tea first, and we can wait inside where it's warm." She accepted this. She sat down at the kitchen table with her purse in her lap and waited for the tea. While I made the tea, I called the neurologist's after-hours line, left a message with what had happened, stood at the counter while the kettle heated and listened to the absolute quiet of the house and thought about how alone I was in that moment, not in a self-pitying way, just as a plain fact. There was no one to call at 2 in the morning. My parents were asleep an hour away. Ryan was asleep 20 minutes away. There was just me and Grandma and the kettle. She drank her tea. Eventually, she got confused about why she had her coat on. I helped her take it off and walked her back to bed and sat in the chair in the corner of her room until I was sure she was asleep. Then I went back to my own room and lay on top of the covers because I was too tired to get under them. And I stared at the ceiling and thought very clearly, we are in the last part of this. I told my mother the next day, described the coat, the bus, the purse, the specific quality of her certainty. My mother said that sounded really hard and asked if I'd thought about respite care. I said what I actually needed was for someone else in the family to take a turn being the person who was here. She said she'd talk to my father about it. She did not call back that week or the next. I hired a part-time home health aide named Dolores who came 3 mornings a week and was one of the most competent people I've ever met. Grandma liked her immediately. Having Dolores there gave me breathing room, but the nights were still mine. The decisions were still mine. My parents started calling more often that spring, which felt in retrospect like reconnaissance. My mother asked how Grandma seemed. My father asked twice about the roof and the property taxes. I'd handled both. He said, good, good. I didn't think much about those calls at the time. I was too tired to read subtext. What I found out later, from a cousin who'd overheard things, was that my parents had started talking about the house that spring, not about care or maintenance or wishes, about value. They'd had it informally appraised. There was a number. Numbers have a way of making people interested in the future in a particular way. The month between the attorney visit and her death was settled, like she had finished what she needed to do and was letting the rest of it go at its own pace. She slept more. She was less agitated. She sat in her chair by the window in the afternoons, and sometimes she knew who I was, and sometimes she called me by her sister's name, and both were okay. I made her tea and sat near her, and we watched the light change on the backyard through the window, and she hummed sometimes, those old songs. I held her hand on the last morning. She didn't know my name. She knew I was someone who loved her, which might be the more important thing anyway. Grief does strange things to time. The weeks after she died didn't feel like weeks. weeks. They felt like one very long, strange day that kept resetting in the morning. I handled the immediate logistics because no one else was positioned to. I called the funeral home. I found the folder in the filing cabinet where Grandma had kept her arrangements. She'd prepaid, which I hadn't known, which was exactly the kind of quietly practical thing she would have done. I called extended family. I made a list of who needed to be told and worked through it systematically, one call at a time, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold next to me. My parents arrived the day she passed. My mother cried, genuinely. My father stood in the kitchen looking at the floor. Ryan arrived that evening, gave me an awkward hug, and stood in the living room looking at his phone. His wife sent a fruit basket that arrived 2 days later. The funeral was small, the way Grandma had wanted. About 40 people. Old friends, some neighbors, some family. People said the right things. Afterward, there was a reception back at the house that I organized, and I stood in the kitchen refilling water pitchers and watching my family receive condolences in the front rooms, and I thought how strange it was to be the one who had been there every day and yet be the one standing in the back. 3 days after the funeral, before most of the casseroles in the refrigerator had even been eaten, my father brought up the estate. He did it in a way designed to sound responsible. He sat down at the kitchen table and said that given everything, now would probably be a good time to start thinking practically about next steps. He said he and my mother had talked, and they thought the wisest thing would be to handle the property as a family. I said I thought that was a conversation for later, and he said he just didn't want things to get complicated. That word, complicated, told me everything. People who aren't planning to do anything inconvenient don't preemptively worry about complications. He brought it up again 4 days later. That time my mother was there too, and they used language like coordinating the estate and making sure everyone is protected and being fair to all parties. Ryan joined by phone. He was very calm, very reasonable, the way people are when they've already decided what the answer is and want it to arrive without conflict. He said the house was a significant asset and it wouldn't be right for any one person to have undue control over a family asset. That phrase, undue control, had a particular flavor. I noted it and said nothing. What none of them said in any of these early conversations was thank you. Not for the 3 years, not for the 2 in the morning moments, not for keeping the house running so Grandma could die in her own home. There is a specific kind of erasure that happens when the people who were absent for a thing show up to divide the result of it. It has a texture I can still feel. The probing continued. My mother asked if there was a will she hadn't seen. My father asked if I was planning to stay long term. Ryan texted once asking if I knew anything about the house being in a trust. I stared at that for a full minute before writing back that I wasn't sure of all the estate details, which was one of the most technically accurate things I said during that period. I had spoken twice with Patricia by then. She told me the structure was solid, the execution had been impeccable, and Grandma had been very clear about what she wanted. She told me to wait and see what the family did, and to document everything in the meantime. So I documented everything. Let me tell you what actually happened at that attorney's office, because the version I gave you before was the short version, and it deserves more than that. It was a Thursday in October, about 3 weeks before Grandma died, though I didn't know that at the time. I knew the end was somewhere close. The hospice nurse had started coming twice a week instead of once, but I'd stopped trying to predict specific timelines after the neurologist told me early in the year that dementia didn't follow schedules. It was one of those autumn mornings that feels like the whole world has been cleaned overnight. The leaves were past peak but still holding, mostly gold and a faded copper color, and the light came in sideways the way it does in October and made everything look considered, like someone had arranged it. Grandma was having a good morning. She'd woken up clear, which still happened a few times a week back then, and she'd dressed herself without prompting and come downstairs and asked if I'd made coffee. We had coffee. We talked about nothing in particular. The garden, which she still kept mental tabs on even though she could no longer tend it herself, and something she'd seen on the news that she didn't quite have the context for but had opinions about anyway. She was funny that morning, sharp in the old way. Then she set her cup down and said, I need you to drive me somewhere this afternoon. I have an appointment. I asked where. She said Patricia's office downtown. I knew Patricia was her attorney because I'd found correspondence from the office in the filing cabinet when I first moved in and organized the house papers, but Grandma had never mentioned her to me directly, and I hadn't asked because the estate wasn't my business to press her on. I said of course what time, and she said 2 o'clock, and that was the whole conversation. We left at 1:30. Grandma wore her good cardigan and brought the leather purse she saved for specific occasions. She was composed the whole drive, watched the town go by, commented on a building she remembered differently. Patricia's office was on the second floor of a building off the main block. Narrow staircase, wooden railing that Grandma held with both hands. The waiting room had 2 chairs, no receptionist, just a door with Patricia's name on it. Grandma knocked and Patricia opened it almost immediately, which told me she'd been watching the clock. Patricia was maybe 65, gray-haired, reading glasses on her forehead. She shook Grandma's hand and looked at me with an expression that was assessing, but not unfriendly. Grandma said, this is my granddaughter Mara. Patricia said she'd heard about me. The door closed. I sat and didn't read the magazine I was holding. 45 minutes passed. It felt longer. When the door opened, Grandma came out first, walking steadily, and behind her, Patricia was carrying a folder. They were talking in low voices that stopped when they saw me. Patricia handed Grandma the folder, and they shook hands again, and then Patricia looked at me and said, do you have a few minutes? Grandma sat in the waiting room chair and opened her purse and looked through it in the way she sometimes did when she needed something to do with her hands, and I went into Patricia's office and sat down across the desk from her. Patricia told me that Grandma had updated her estate documents. She said she'd been advising Grandma on this for about 18 months, and that the process had involved involved multiple appointments, multiple conversations, and, she said this deliberately, multiple assessments to ensure Grandma understood fully what she was doing and was doing it of her own free will. I said I didn't understand why she was telling me. Patricia said because Grandma had asked her to. She said Grandma wanted me to know that what she'd done had been done clearly and intentionally, and that she'd had her reasons, and that those reasons were documented. She slid a single page across the desk. It was a summary. No legal language, just plain sentences, explaining that Grandma had placed the house and associated property into an irrevocable trust with me as sole trustee, and that this had been notarized and filed, and that the effective date was that day. I read it twice. Then I said, why didn't she tell me herself? Patricia said that was a question I should ask Grandma. Then she said something else, something I thought about many times since. She said, your grandmother told me she didn't want you to do what you were doing for any reason other than love. She didn't want you to know there was anything in it for you because she wanted to be sure. I sat with that for a moment. Then I thanked Patricia and walked back to the waiting room, and Grandma looked up at me with those clear October eyes and said, well, should we get lunch? In the car on the way to the diner, she didn't ask what Patricia had said to me, and I didn't ask what had happened in the office. We talked about what we were going to order. She got grilled cheese and tomato soup, which she always got. I got a sandwich I barely ate because my mind was somewhere else entirely. She didn't bring it up at lunch. She didn't bring it up on the drive home. She didn't bring it up again before she died. But when we got back to the house that afternoon, she sat down in her chair by the window and reached over and patted my hand, just the pat, the same one she'd always given me. And I understood that this was the closest she was going to come to saying what she needed to say. I understood that she had been watching all this time from the chair by the window, and that she'd seen everything. The 2 months between the envelope arriving and the dinner where they gave me 2 days were the strangest of my adult life, because I was performing one thing while preparing for another. Outwardly, I was the grieving granddaughter managing an estate. I talked to my parents regularly. I answered Ryan's texts. I was cooperative and mild and gave nothing away. When my father mentioned the property again, I said I was working with the attorney to understand everything. When my mother asked about the timeline, I said these things took time. Inwardly, I was doing something that did not feel natural to me, because I am not by nature a strategic person. I was building a record. Patricia had suggested it. She'd said that in situations like this, the documentation of intent mattered as much as the legal documents themselves. She said if the family challenged the trust, and she thought they might, the strongest position I could be in was one where I could demonstrate clearly, with evidence, what had actually happened over the past 3 years and what my role in it had been. She said the other side would try to argue that Grandma had been manipulated. The counter-argument was a paper trail so thorough that manipulation became implausible, so I gathered everything I had, which was more than I'd realized. 3 years of appointment notebooks in a shoebox on the closet shelf, receipts, pharmacy, grocery, hardware, the repair invoices with my name on them, gas station charges from all those drives, the hospice care log, a spiral notebook where I'd written daily notes on Grandma's condition and medications. I printed emails from every doctor's office, pulled screenshots of my texts with Dolores going back 2 years, downloaded my bank records and highlighted every house charge, utilities, repairs, things I'd fronted, and sometimes never been reimbursed for. Dolores wrote a 2-page statement, handwritten, and mailed it to Patricia's office. It described 3 years of consistent engagement on my part and 0 from any other family member in her direct experience. I put everything in a box. The box went in the closet, and I waited. The dinner came in late January. I drove there knowing the shape of what was coming. My father ended conversations now with, we really do need to sit down soon. Ryan had texted twice about the estate in the prior week. The table was set. My mother had made pot roast. Ryan was there with his wife Stephanie, whose presence told me this was meant to carry formal weight. They were all very reasonable. My father said the estate was a shared family matter. Ryan said the house was a significant asset, not practical to be managed by one person indefinitely. Stephanie smiled and touched her stomach. She was pregnant. I hadn't known. No one had told me. I said congratulations. I meant it. My mother said they recognized my enormous effort and wanted to make sure I was taken care of too. A sale would give me financial stability. Given that I'd been working part-time for 3 years, that was meant to sting. It did. A little. I said I needed time to process. My father said they'd give me a couple of days to get the process started. I drove back to the house, sat in Grandma's chair in the dark. Then I pulled out the box from the closet and checked everything was in order. It was. I was scared that night. Not of losing the house, which I knew was protected. I was scared of what the next few days were going to cost. What it would feel like watching people discover that the story they'd told themselves wasn't true. I went to bed. I slept better than I expected. The 2 days between the dinner and Friday had their own particular quality, like the air before a storm that takes its time arriving. I didn't call anyone. I just moved through those 48 hours quietly, doing the things that needed doing. The first thing I did, the morning after the dinner, was go through the house deliberately, not packing, moving. I walked from room to room and looked at everything the way you look at something when you're trying to hold it. The kitchen with its old tile backsplash and the window above the sink that looked out over the side yard. The dining room with the table that seated 8 when the leaves were in. The living room with Grandma's chair still positioned where she'd always kept it, angled toward both the window and the television. The study with its bookshelves and the old wooden desk and the wall safe set into the plaster behind a framed watercolor of the coast. I opened the safe and checked what was inside. The trust documents, the notarized copies, the letter from Patricia confirming the transfer, a handwritten note from Grandma that I'd placed there myself after the envelope arrived. The note was in her handwriting. Clear, careful letters, the way she wrote when she was being deliberate. She'd written it, I think, during one of her better days in the final months. It said, "The house belongs to the one who is here. You know who that is. So do I." I closed the safe. I left the key in the top drawer of the hallway console, exactly where it had always been, exactly where my father would know to look. On the first day, I also called Patricia, just to confirm she was available if anything unexpected came up Friday. She said she wasn't worried. I said I was a little worried. She said that was reasonable, and that being a little worried was different from having a reason to be. She said the documents were solid. She said Grandma had done everything right. On the second day, Thursday, I put some boxes in the guest room. This was the performance, the part I'd thought about. If my family arrived and saw no boxes, no evidence of movement, they would know immediately that I wasn't complying, and the confrontation would happen in a different and harder way. I needed them to feel like they'd won, at least until they opened the safe. So I carried some boxes upstairs and labeled them with a marker: books, winter, misc, and stacked them by the guest room wall where they could be seen from the doorway. None of the boxes had anything in them. I hadn't packed a single actual item. I also cleaned the house. I don't entirely know why. Habit, maybe. Or the same instinct that makes people straighten their clothes before a difficult conversation. I swept floors, wiped down the kitchen counters, put fresh towels in the bathroom. The house looked cared for, which it was and which I wanted it to be going into whatever was coming next. Thursday evening, I called Claire just to hear a voice that was on my side. We talked for an hour and it helped more than I expected. When she asked about the estate, I said things were going to get clearer soon. She said she trusted me. That mattered. I didn't sleep well Thursday night, but I slept. I woke early, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table while the morning came through the window. Grandma had sat at this same table for 40 years. Same window, same sideways light. Something in that continuity felt like the opposite of loss. By noon, I was calm in a way that surprised me. Not detached. I felt everything, but steadied. My father texted at 2 to say they'd be there at 4:30. I replied okay. At 3, I walked the house one more time. I stopped at the safe for a moment and didn't open it, just stood there. I thought about Grandma sitting in the waiting room chair with her good purse in her lap, having decided something, having known what she was doing and why. I thought about what Patricia had told me, that she hadn't wanted me to know. Not until she was certain. Not until I'd had enough time to prove it to both of us. She'd watched from that chair. She'd seen everything. At 4:15, I put the kettle on. I wasn't going to offer them tea. I just needed something to do with my hands. At 4:30, the car pulled into the driveway. There were 3 of them. I'd expected my parents. Ryan showing up with them told me they'd coordinated the arrival, which told me they wanted numbers. My father came in first, which was habit. He was the kind of person who walked into rooms first and let others follow his lead. My mother came in behind him. Ryan last, hands in his pockets, looking around the foyer with an expression he was trying to keep neutral and not quite managing. Nobody hugged me. That struck me later as something worth noting. My mother said hello in a voice that was careful around the edges. My father said, "We appreciate you being cooperative about this," which was an interesting thing to say given that I hadn't agreed to anything. I said, "Come in." I stepped back. They came in. There was a moment where no one spoke, and everyone was pretending they weren't looking around the house, cataloging it, checking that nothing had disappeared. I watched their eyes move even as their faces stayed composed. My father said he'd like to get the safe contents organized. He used organized, not opened, which was its own kind of tell. He asked for the key. I said it was in the hallway console, top drawer, where it had always been. He went to the drawer. He found the key immediately, because that's where it had been for 20 years. My mother drifted toward the study. Ryan followed. I stayed at the edge of the hallway. The study felt smaller with the 3 of them in it. There was the desk, the bookshelves, the framed watercolor over the safe. My father moved the watercolor aside. He knew where it was. He'd asked Grandma about that safe more than once over the years, and fitted the key. The safe door swung open. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened. Then he reached in and picked up the envelope. Grandma's handwriting on the front. Her careful, deliberate letters. His thumb went under the flap. He read the first page. He didn't make a sound. He read it again. Then his hand went still, and I could see the change move through him. Not dramatic. Not movie dramatic. Quiet. His shoulders settled differently, like something he'd been holding gave way. My mother said, "What is it?" He handed her the top page without looking at her. She read faster, then stopped, went back to the top, started again slower. Ryan craned over her shoulder. When he got far enough down, I watched his face shift, not understanding yet, just the sense of ground that wasn't what he'd expected. My mother picked up the next page, the full trust document. She found my name in the first section, and I watched her find it, her eyes going still for a moment before moving on. Ryan said, "What does it say?" No one answered. My mother set the page down and picked up the smaller envelope inside. Grandma's note. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the way you recognize someone's voice. A small physical reaction, a slight stillness before she opened it. She read it. She read it again. Her face when she looked up was not the face I'd been bracing for. It wasn't anger. Not then. It was something closer to disorientation, like a person who has walked into a familiar room and found the furniture rearranged. She looked at me. She said my name. Just my name, like a question with no question attached to it. I said what Grandma had told me to understand from all of it. The house was hers to give to whoever she wanted. She wanted it to be mine. Ryan said that's not, no, and then stopped. He tried again. He said Grandma would never have, and then stopped again. He was looking for a sentence that would make what he'd just read not be true, and he couldn't find one. My father didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally looked up from the floor, he looked older than he had when he walked in. That sounds like something people say figuratively, but I mean it as a description. The confidence he'd walked in with had been the kind built on assuming a particular outcome, and when that outcome turned out not to be available, there wasn't much left underneath it. He said she would have told us. I said she told me. Nobody had anything anything to say to that. My mother gathered the papers back together with careful hands. Ryan stepped back from the desk. My father stood up from the chair without looking at me, the way people stand up from somewhere they want to pretend they never sat. They left 10 minutes later. My father first, Ryan behind him. My mother paused in the study doorway, looked back once, and left. She forgot her jacket on the entry chair, came back for it halfway to the car, didn't look at me. The door closed. I stood in the hallway for a while without moving, not triumphant, something more like wrung out. The feeling after a storm that's been building long enough that when it finally arrives, you're not sure what to feel first. I walked back to the study, picked up Grandma's note from the desk, read it once more, put it back in the safe, and closed the door. The first call came 4 minutes later. I watched my mother's name on the screen and let it ring. The voicemails came in waves. The first wave was my mother. 6 calls in 20 minutes, each one going to voicemail because I didn't answer. I let them stack up like the evidence Patricia had told me to collect because they were evidence of the panic, of the stakes, of exactly how much they'd been counting on a different outcome. The first message was breathless. She said, "We need to talk before you do anything with those documents." The lawyer, "The documents, please." She said, "Don't do this," like I was the one doing something to her. The second said there had been a misunderstanding. The third was where the argument started forming. Grandma's memory had been unreliable. She might not have understood what she was signing. The attorney should be looked into. I saved that one in 2 separate places. The fourth message was my father. He sounded like a man who'd decided on a strategy. He said the word fair 3 times in 90 seconds, which told me he'd already spoken to someone about his options. Ryan texted that he just wanted to understand what Grandma had actually intended, as if 3 years of presence were ambiguous. I didn't respond to any of it that night. I made dinner. I ate it at the kitchen table, which didn't feel too large anymore. I washed the dishes. I walked through the house one more time, turning lights off as I went, the way I'd done every night for 3 years. The floorboard in the second-floor hallway creaked the same way it always creaked. The bathroom faucet needed the extra quarter turn to stop dripping. The back window showed the yard dark and quiet in the winter night. I went to bed and I slept. The following week was harder than the Friday had been. My father retained an attorney. I found out through Claire, who found out through a cousin. The attorney had experience in estate challenges. My father was apparently telling people that Grandma had been taken advantage of in her final months, that the trust had been executed under suspicious circumstances. Patricia told me to stay calm and keep documenting. She said this was expected and that the structure of the trust was designed for exactly this kind of challenge. She said the assessment record alone would make the undue influence argument very difficult to sustain. I kept my head down. I went back to work full time. I talked to Claire when the weeks got heavy. I sat in Grandma's chair some evenings and let the house be quiet around me. Ryan texted me once more 3 weeks later. He said he didn't have anything against me personally, that this was just about what was right for the family. I thought about what family meant to him and whether my 3 years in that house figured into his definition of it. I didn't reply. My father's estate challenge went nowhere. Patricia had been right about the documentation. After it was dropped, he went quiet in the way of someone recalculating a long-held assumption. Ryan's wife had the baby in June, a boy, and they sent a birth announcement with a note from Stephanie saying she hoped things could be different. I'm still thinking about how to respond. My mother called once from a different number. I answered without knowing it was her. Her voice was quieter than the voicemails, less strategy in it. She said she wasn't sure she'd handled any of this well. She said she knew I'd been there when she hadn't been. I told her the house was going to stay what it was, that if she wanted a relationship, it would have to be built on something other than what the house could give her. She said she understood. I don't know if she did. What I know is this: I am still here. The house is still here. The floorboard in the upstairs hallway still creaks in exactly the same place, and the faucet in the back bathroom still needs that extra quarter turn. And on good afternoons, the light through the kitchen window still comes in sideways the way October light does, the way it did every morning for 3 years while I made coffee and sorted medications and learned what it meant to actually stay. Grandma knew what she was doing when she put on her good cardigan and brought her best purse to that appointment. She'd watched from her chair long enough to see all of it. Who came, who didn't, who fixed things when they broke, who showed up in the 2 in the morning moments when there was no audience and nothing to gain. She knew. And she sat across from me in that diner booth with her grilled cheese and her tomato soup and her road trip story from 1974. And she did not tell me what she'd done because she wanted to be sure. She had always wanted, more than anything, for the people she loved to prove themselves to themselves before she confirmed what she already knew. I think that's the most like her thing she could have done. I keep her note in the safe. I open it sometimes, not often, just enough to remember what her handwriting looked like when she was being deliberate. Those careful letters, that last sentence, "You know who that is?" "So do I." "Yeah, Grandma, I do."